November 22nd, 1910. A private railcar slips out of a station in Hoboken, New Jersey, under cover of darkness. Inside are 6 of the most powerful men in America. But that night, not one of them uses his real name. They call each other only by first names, no surnames, not even in front of the staff. One of them carries a borrowed shotgun, just in case anyone asks what they're doing. Where are they going? And why would 6 of the most powerful men in the country need to hide who they were? The answer would shape the next 100 years of the global economy. Because that secret trip was the beginning of one of the most powerful institutions ever created. The institution that today decides what the dollar in your pocket is actually worth. This is the story of how the Federal Reserve was born. And it didn't start in a courtroom or a congressional chamber. It started behind a locked door on a private island most Americans had never heard of. At the start of the 20th century, the United States was the fastest growing economy on Earth. But underneath that growth was a dangerous flaw. Almost alone among the major industrial powers, America had no central bank. When Britain or France faced a financial shock, their central banks could step in, inject money, cut rates, act as a backstop. America had nothing like that. Between 1863 and 1910 alone, the country had already suffered 3 major banking panics and 8 smaller ones. Every time confidence broke, the whole system simply had to fall until it hit bottom. Part of the problem was structural. America's money supply was almost frozen in place. It couldn't expand or contract with the seasons. Every autumn, farmers across the country needed cash to move their harvests to market, and banks scrambled to find currency to end. There was no mechanism to add money into the system when demand spiked, and no mechanism to safely absorb it when demand fell. Economists at the time called this the absence of an elastic currency, and it meant that ordinary seasonal stress could tip into full-blown panic with almost no warning. In 1907, it hit bottom hard. It started with a rumor, a single rumor that one major New York trust company, the Knickerbocker Trust, was about to collapse. That was enough. Depositors rushed the banks, lining up around city blocks in the cold October air to pull out their savings. One failure dragged down the next. The New York Stock Exchange lost nearly half its value in weeks, and the panic spread to cities across the country, from Chicago to San Francisco. Who stepped in to stop it? Not the government. Not Congress. One man, the most powerful banker on Wall Street, J.P. Morgan. At 70 years old, Morgan summoned the country's top bankers into his private library, locked the doors, and refused to let anyone leave until they agreed to pledge money to save the system. Night after night, he personally decided which banks deserved rescue, famously playing solitaire alone in another room while the fate of entire institutions hung on his judgment. He convinced the Treasury Secretary to deposit government funds into the shakiest banks and pressured the country's wealthiest men, including John D. Rockefeller, to pledge millions from their own fortunes. At one point, he even personally guaranteed the finances of New York City itself, which had run out of cash to pay its own employees. America survived. But the panic left Washington with an uncomfortable question. What happens next time if there's no J.P. Morgan willing or alive to bail out the entire country? Congress couldn't ignore what had happened. In 1908, Senator Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and, through marriage, father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr., pushed through a law creating the National Monetary Commission, an 18-member body tasked with finding a permanent fix. Aldrich didn't trust the technical work to career politicians. He hired his own advisors, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan's own firm, and Abe Lowell's, Piat Andrew, a Harvard economist, and together they set off for Europe. For nearly 2 years, they crossed the Atlantic again and again, studying the great central banks of the Old World, the Reichsbank in Berlin, the Bank of England, the Banque de France in Paris, interviewing central bankers and government ministers, and poring over decades of data on how these institutions absorbed shocks and coordinated across an entire national banking system. What they found stunned them. Compared to Europe's coordinated, flexible systems, able to expand the money supply exactly when needed and contract it just as easily, America's patchwork of thousands of independent banks looked almost primitive, like a relic from an earlier century. They were struck by how much more central the pound and the franc had become to global trade than the dollar, despite the sheer size of the American economy. They came home convinced the United States needed its own central bank, built along European broadly lines. But saying that out loud in a country deeply suspicious of concentrated financial power was a completely different problem. By the fall of 1910, Aldrich needed to turn 2 years of research into an actual plan, fast and away from prying eyes. He handpicked a small group of the sharpest financial minds in the country and took them to Jekyll Island, a private hunting club off the coast of Georgia. So exclusive a magazine once called it the richest, the most inaccessible club in the world, a winter retreat for a handful of America's wealthiest families. The group called itself the First Name Club. To avoid being recognized, the men boarded separately and staggered their arrivals, referring to each other only by first names for the entire trip. With Aldrich were Henry Davison, the Morgan partner, many historians believe first suggested the whole idea, Frank Vanderlip, president of one of the largest banks in America, Paul Warburg, a German-trained banking expert who understood European central banking better than almost anyone in the country, and, critically, A. Piat Andrew, by then the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, giving the group an official government voice at the table. For 9 days, hidden inside the island clubhouse, pausing only for a Thanksgiving dinner of wild turkey and oyster stuffing, these men drafted the blueprint for an entirely new banking system. They worked from before dawn until late into the night, debating structure, reserve requirements, and how much power should sit with government versus the banks themselves. Why all the secrecy? Because they knew exactly what it would look like if the public found out the country's banking laws were being written in a locked room on a private island by the country's biggest bankers. Of the six, Warburg had seen this coming longest. An immigrant from a prominent banking family in Hamburg, he'd been stunned by how fragile American banking looked next to Europe's, and had spent years publishing essays warning of exactly this kind of crisis. Ideas dismissed at first as too foreign for American tastes, until 1907 proved him right. By 1910, he wasn't just a guest at Jekyll Island. He was arguably the intellectual architect of the whole plan, translating decades of European theory into a form that might survive American politics. When Aldrich unveiled the plan in January 1911, he ran straight into a wall of suspicion, despite a full year spent quietly revising it to make it more politically palatable. Critics called it a Wall Street power grab dressed up as reform. Farmers and small business owners across the South and West, still wary of concentrated Eastern banking power after decades of fighting railroad monopolies, saw a central bank designed by bankers as exactly the threat they feared most. Newspapers ran editorials warning that the Aldrich Plan would hand permanent control of the nation's money to a small circle of New York financiers. The Aldrich name itself, tied to Wall Street and the Rockefellers, became politically toxic almost overnight, a gift to his opponents that made the bill nearly impossible to pass as written. The turning point came in 1912, when Woodrow Wilson won the presidency on a platform that explicitly promised banking reform, and Democrats took control of both houses of Congress for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Wilson and his allies, Representative Carter Glass of Virginia and Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma, rebuilt the plan almost from the ground up. They kept its technical core, much of it quietly traceable back to Jekyll Island, but stripped away anything that smelled of direct, permanent private banker control. Instead of one central bank run by private bankers, they designed 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread across the country, each reflecting local economic conditions, all overseen by a Federal Reserve Board appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. The debate dragged on for the better part of a year, fought clause by clause between competing House and Senate drafts. Even with Wilson's redesign, one fight nearly derailed everything at the final hour. William Jennings Bryan, 3-time presidential candidate, hero to millions of American farmers, and by 1913, Wilson's own secretary, declared Federal Reserve notes to be obligations of the United States, a public currency issued through a hybrid public-private system, but backed by the government, not by Wall Street. That single concession was enough to bring the populist wing of the party on board, and it cleared the last real obstacle to passage just weeks before Christmas. On December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, while most of the country was focused on the holidays, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, using several pens so the key figures behind the bill could each keep one as a memento. The Fed was born. For more than a century since, it has remained one of the most fiercely debated institutions in American history. Supporters call it the firewall that kept the country from repeating disasters like 1907 and the Great Depression, when a lack of decisive central bank action turned a stock market crash into a decade-long collapse. Critics argue an institution born in secrecy, drafted largely by the men it would go on to regulate, was never fully accountable to the public it serves. It's worth being clear. Some of the more extreme conspiracy theories that later grew around this story, including anti-Semitic claims targeting Warburg's background, have been thoroughly debunked by historians and have no documentary basis. But the more grounded debate about how much influence private banking interests had in shaping a public institution is one economists and historians still argue over today. Less than a year later, in November 1914, the 12 reserve banks quietly opened for business, just months after war broke out in Europe. The system built to prevent the next 1907 faced its first real test almost immediately, helping finance America's path through World War I and stabilizing a financial system suddenly cut off from its usual European trading partners. What makes this system so unusual is its structure. The Fed isn't one bank. It's a network of 12 regional reserve banks, each serving its own part of the country, connected to a board of governors in Washington. It's neither a private company nor a normal government agency, a hybrid that had never quite existed before, and still has no exact equivalent anywhere else in the world. Each reserve bank is technically owned by the commercial banks in its district, yet its leadership is publicly confirmed, and its profits go to the U.S. Treasury, not private shareholders, a direct legacy of Bryan's insistence that the currency ultimately belonged to the public, not to Wall Street. Today, the Fed's main tools are setting short-term interest rates, buying and selling government bonds to add or remove money from the system, and acting as lender of last resort, exactly the role no single institution could fill in 1907, no matter how wealthy. When the Fed raises rates, borrowing gets more expensive across the whole economy, cooling inflation but often slowing growth. When it cuts rates, the opposite happens. Cheaper borrowing, faster growth, but the risk of prices rising too quickly. Every one of those decisions ripples outward from 12 regional boardrooms designed in their basic outline by 6 men on a hunting island more than 100 years ago. And that hybrid design is exactly why, over a century later, people still argue about who the Fed really answers to: the government, the banks, or the public. Today, when the Fed chair steps up to announce an interest rate decision, financial markets around the world stop and listen. A single decision in Washington can send a currency on the other side of the planet soaring or crashing within hours. The dollar index, gold prices, oil, even Bitcoin, all still move in the shadow of decisions made in that boardroom. When the 2008 crisis threatened to repeat 1907 at global scale, it was the Fed itself that stepped in as lender of last resort, exactly the role the system was built for in the first place. It happened again in 2020, when the Fed moved within days to backstop markets frozen by a global pandemic, something no institution could have done in 1907. Every Fed chair since, from William McChesney Martin through Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and up to today, has inherited this same hybrid, unusual institution, still wrestling with the same unresolved question that started it all. How much power should remain with a small group of experts, insulated from daily politics, over something as fundamental as the value of money itself? All of that power traces back to one secret night train, one hidden island, and 6 men who wouldn't even use their own names. But the Fed's story is only the opening chapter of a much longer saga. Because just over half a century later, a decision made on an unusual Sunday evening in Washington would sever the dollar's last remaining link to gold, forever, without warning, and reshape the entire global financial order in a single weekend. The men who met in secret on Jekyll Island in 1910 built a system meant to prevent panics. They never imagined it would one day preside over a currency with no gold behind it at all, backed by nothing but trust and the institution they built to manage it. That's the story of our next episode, the Nixon shock of 1971. Follow the channel so you don't miss it.